We need to announce that he passed away, and his visitation will be at Collier's from 12 to 1:30, and then a graveside service at Memorial Gardens, I believe. So sympathy goes out to all those who connected with him. Hate to hear that. Cole has COVID this morning. Billy Riley, the stomach virus. Joy still recouping from eye surgery. Jeremy Holiday with us. Gail English sick with allergies this morning. Pam Edwards, back problems this morning. Are there any more sick in our number? Shirley Groves has COVID. Okay. Let's see. Diana Hopgood got a good report on her checkup. Judy Newcomb has been having heart issues. Teresa Barton had surgery, and she passes along that she is so grateful for all the thoughts, prayers, cards, calls, anything that's been done for her during her time that she's been battling breast cancer. Charlene Lovett, Mark Travis, Diane Stice, Nancy York, that's Susie Groves' mother. Eddie Kraft is a friend of Jerry and Kathy's. He has cancer. Lee Bailey had heart surgery. Kathy Cook, the mother-in-law of Jeff's brother, has cancer. Gerald Rainey home from the hospital. Robert Phelps will have a heart procedure done next Thursday, this coming Thursday in Atlanta. That's all the sick that I have. Anybody else have anything to add? Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're so humbled that we are able to assemble here today and study deeper into your word, the things that are eternal to our souls. Let us learn something from this Bible study this morning, and more importantly, let us apply it to our everyday walks of life. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. Glad you're able to be here and a part of our Bible study. As all of you, I think, know, we're in Acts chapter 17, and we're talking about Paul's second missionary journey. We'll continue our study of Acts 17 this morning. Last week we introduced the account as Paul came into Thessalonica and then, unfortunately, moved on to Berea quicker than he would have liked. And so we talked about how in 1 Thessalonians, Paul refers to some of these details. And we left off just making an observation about Paul himself and thinking about the concern he had for these people. You can remember that Paul came into Thessalonica, and where did he go? What was his custom? He went to the synagogue. Some places didn't have a synagogue, but Thessalonica did have a synagogue, and he went there, And we pointed out how he needed to lay some groundwork in order to bring them to an understanding about the gospel. That groundwork involved first teaching that the Christ had to suffer, right? They had to get in their minds that the one prophesied in the Old Testament that they envisioned as being a king would in fact have to suffer. Now, is Christ our king? Well, what was the problem in their mind about the kind of king they anticipated? That's right. Hibernia said they wanted a king like they had. And they envisioned this return to the glorious days, right, of like David and Solomon. And the Old Testament had predicted that the Messiah would rule and he would have a kingdom. But we then learn it was going to be a kingdom of a different kind. Now, this wouldn't be a downgraded kingdom. It would actually be a much better kingdom because it would fulfill the needs of people far beyond the needs of this life. And so Paul had to convince them that the Christ had to suffer. And we pointed out how even the apostles had a hard time getting that in their minds, right? And we all go to Matthew 16 in our minds thinking about Peter confronting Jesus. This is not going to happen. Mark? Right, right. That's exactly right. It just looks like defeat. You know, this is your king, and that was the mocking, right? They laughed as Jesus is on the cross. King of the Jews, if you can imagine that. So Paul has to lay this foundation. He does so. And this is what we'll highlight, and we'll reiterate this with the account of Paul in Berea. He used the scriptures. What would be the ultimate source to answer questions about God's plan? The scriptures. Paul was not preaching something new about the Christ because this is in the Bible. Now he came to he left Thessalonica, went to Berea, and you remember the statement about the Bereans, the Jews in that synagogue were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. And so they understood the scriptures are going to be the final source, the ultimate authority for answering questions about God's plan. So they could check what Paul says by the scriptures. When he said the Christ has to suffer, they could check that in the scriptures, like Isaiah 53. They could check that. And so we remember these details, and I bring you back to this point about Paul leaving Thessalonica quickly. And the Jews show up in Berea. He is escorted out of Berea and will eventually, maybe a few months down the road when he gets to Corinth, he will write 1 Thessalonians. And I just begin with that again today by pointing out that it's just incredible and encouraging when you think about all the trouble Paul's had since he landed in Greece, from beaten in Philippi, persecuted in Thessalonica, is leaving town to town, and finally gets far enough away that they don't pursue him. And who's he concerned about? Those Christians who are new Christians in a city where they're persecuted, and he has no idea how they're doing. And so we read 1 Thessalonians with a little bit of appreciation for the historical details it relates about this anxiety of Paul and sending Timothy back, and Timothy finally catching up with him in Corinth. And Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 talks about just what a blessing it was for him to hear that they are persevering in the face of this persecution, though they are new Christians. And we pointed out that while there were some Jews in Thessalonica who obeyed the gospel, largely from 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, largely the church consisted of people who turned from idols to serve a living God. So add that in. They're new Christians. They're people who have in their past been idol worshipers. They weren't raised in the church. And from the beginning, they're being persecuted. And they don't have the support of the apostle staying on in a long-term sense with them. And they're still persevering. And so we can appreciate them and Paul's concern for them. That brings us to the next town, and that is Athens. So this is Acts chapter 17 in order of Paul working in these various places. Let's think about for a minute how the rest of Acts 17 unfolds. And we see it unfolding along these particular 3 points. We have the reference of Paul working in the city. But most of the chapter has to do with a record of Paul's lesson or his sermon at the Areopagus. The word Areopagus can refer to the place, or it can actually refer to the people, the council. But Paul is brought before them and has this opportunity to talk about his teaching. Most of the chapter is taken up with an account of this. And then finally we have a statement at the end of the chapter regarding responses to Paul's teaching. So let's work our way through this and then make some observations about Paul's work in Athens. We see the summary statement of Paul's arrival and his work in the synagogue and in the marketplace. And so read with me, if you would, from verses 16 to 21. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, and who is them, by the way? Right, Silas and Timothy. His spirit was provoked within him when he saw the city full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout people, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Now Luke gives us some inside information about this place, Athens, and why this was the context in which Paul had an opportunity to talk to people in the marketplace. This was par for the course in Athens. Verse 18 says, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, what does this babbler wish to say? It's interesting that the word babbler literally means seed picker. And so there's kind of an idea here. Maybe babbler brings it out. You know, if somebody's accused of being a babbler, is that a compliment? Probably not a compliment, no. Or what is somebody who's a seed picker? Do you have any idea what that might mean in this context? Right. Right. That's a good explanation. If you didn't hear Jeff, one who makes a living by picking up scraps. You know, he just a little bit here and here, and now, you know, he's going to present his ideas. The point is, they envision Paul as being someone who's just spouting off and saying various things. And so, to them, it was different from what they're used to. That's a good point. That's one way to put it. Right. Yeah, so he's going to come from a different perspective, right? And like Philip pointed out, he's not going to play into their culture where the point of oration or public speaking is to impress by style. Now, it wasn't that Paul was uneducated or incapable of speaking in lofty tones or ideas. But when he explains this in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 4, he talks about that intentionally he avoided this craft. So he would speak in plain English. Well, not English, but you know what I mean. He would speak in plain terms because he's not going to be evaluated on the basis of their cultural models of public speaking. He rejected that because his point is not to impress. His point is convey the truth and not be wrapped up in their cultural expectations. The content of what he had to say was different from what they were used to. Because he wasn't talking about their various gods and how they affected their lives in particular ways. But he was talking about Jesus and the resurrection. Let's read the text and let the text speak for us about this matter. It says in verse 18, some were saying, what does this babbler have to say? Others saying, he seems to be a preacher of foreign deities. Now, they heard enough of what Paul was saying to know he wasn't talking about sports, was he? He was not talking about current events. He was talking about spiritual matters. And attributed to his teaching the idea that, well, maybe he's talking about foreign deities or gods. Now look at the next qualifying statement. Because, why did they say this? Because he was talking about Jesus and the resurrection. In the original language, Jesus is a masculine noun, and resurrection or anastasis is a feminine noun. And it would not be unusual to them for someone to talk about male and female deities, even in a relationship, because as they envision their gods, they were people of the past who were heroes and deified, men and women. And so it may have been, as they heard him talk about Jesus and Anastasis, that they attributed not to those terms the historical facts and realities, but he's talking about foreign deities. Well, some at least thought that, because the text says so. Verse 19 then says that they brought him to the council, and they wanted to know this new teaching that he is presenting. And this, as Luke explains, was not unusual because they lived every day just with the hope of learning something new. And so they had this insatiable curiosity about matters. So that leads us to the heart of this text relative to Paul's work in Athens. And as we reflect upon it, what I want us to consider as we work our way through his speech is, how does this sermon relate to the need that Paul saw in Athens? Now, when he went into the synagogue, okay, by way of contrast, he was able to begin teaching at a different place, right? In other words, a different place in terms of content. He does not have to convince them, the Jews in the synagogues, that the Scriptures are authoritative. He can start with the Scriptures. Well, he was going to do that in Athens because this was a, by and large, secular audience, idol worshipers. So it was not going to be permissible for him to just say, now let me tell you what God said in the Bible. And they're like, we have many gods. So he had to start, you might say, even before the kind of thing he would say in the synagogue. He had to back up and start before with some foundational matters. We know how he takes off on this. We know how he makes this connection. Because as he's walking around, he sees all these idols. He sees one altar with what inscription? To the unknown God. And this is where he takes, you might say, he takes his text from that altar. So you admit there is a God you do not know. Let me talk about the God you do not know. Okay, we all know how he begins and how he approaches the audience. My question is, once we read his sermon, how does the content of his sermon meet the need of these people? They don't know God. So as we work down through that, I think it's very helpful to see how exactly Paul's lesson meets their need. What thoughts he encourages. So, let's think about his sermon along those lines. We know it's going to meet the needs because, after all, he's an apostle and he's inspired. So he's not going to miss a beat in terms of how to address people's needs. He's assisted in a miraculous way to do that. Our challenge as Bible readers is to say, now let's think about what he actually said and discern why this is helpful to people who need to know God. I'm going to make this summary statement and then we'll think about the details of his lesson. That is 4 thoughts, I think, that are really provocative. They just, if we think about them, they make us think, and they ought to. That come out of either the context or his words. And that is, first, a sad reality. There's something very sad here about what's going on in Athens. We see that he comes into the city and he just sees Athens, even in a culture throughout Asia and Greece. This is not new to Paul, seeing an idol out in public, right? This is not new to Paul. But it was so extensive. Luke tells us this. The city was full of idols, and this was just such a sad reality of where people are in Athens. Yeah, he explains the mentality, right? 1 Corinthians 1, the Jews and the Gentiles, and the different barriers they had. So here he is, he's in this city, and this is the sad reality. That inscription on the altar that Paul uses for his text, that is an indication of a sad, sad reality. And it's not just in ancient Athens, but it is a sad reality even today that there are people who just don't know God. For one reason or another, and we can explore what those reasons could be. But just that idea, somebody doesn't know God. Either in terms of just an intellectual awareness of who the Creator is. That's a sad reality. Think of all the people in India or in Southeast Asia who are very much like modern-day Athenians in terms of they believe in hundreds, if not thousands of gods. They're terrified in many different ways. They don't know God. That is a sad reality. Yeah, and that's right. There's so many that don't want to know. We could even say there are people who know more truth about God, but it doesn't affect them. So there's that too. Let's think about just summarizing what we're going to read here. Paul, in his statement, actually more than one statement, identifies this important thought. Whatever people think about God is connected with how they live. And that's inseparable. And you see this in a number of instances in this text, and it's kind of a self-evident truth that we see in our world today too. Depending on how people think about God has a real impact on how they live. Let me ask you, let's say your neighbor has moved out and the house is vacant, it's up for sale, and you learn there are two prospective buyers that may buy this property and move next door to you. And you learn about these people that one of them, you don't know all the details, but you know they believe in God, they believe in right and wrong, and they believe people are going to be accountable to God for how they live one day. But then somebody else is a prospective buyer, and you learn they don't believe in God, they don't believe in right and wrong, and they don't believe they're ever going to be held accountable for how they live. Who do you want to be your neighbor? Now you're judging people. Look at that. Judging people. Now, that's not far-fetched, right? What we know in the course of our own life and experience, and what we know from the Bible, is that what people think about God has a real connection with how they live. And this was true of the Athenians as well. We're also going to see this unavoidable pursuit, that there is this gnawing on people about the God question. Now, we may suppress it, we may avoid it and act like it's not there, but as the human race exists, there is an insatiable desire to have answers. Now, some people don't like the answer that God is our creator, right? And they spend their whole lives and their careers trying to prove there is no God. We mentioned a number of weeks ago Richard Dawkins, who wrote almost 20 years ago the book The God Delusion. He spent his whole career aggressively, heavily invested in trying to answer the God question. And so what we find in Athens is characteristic of human beings everywhere and all time. And they had this insatiable desire to learn some new thing, to learn about the gods, as they would put it, and to make connections between their life and these realities. So there's this thirst for answers. Paul's trying to give them the answer that really fulfills the soul and the needs for knowing where we came from and where we're going and all of that. Now then we find Paul providing a logical conclusion. He makes a connection with them. That there is always something within human beings because of the way they're made that is a fitting point for the gospel to plug into. So even if you take people like the Athenians who don't know God, they believe in all these false gods, their whole view of reality is 180 degrees from what we would think about in terms of how the world works and what we need to be concerned about. They had this complete different worldview with their history and their gods. But even they have something that the gospel can plug into. And Paul appeals to what we might call the law of rationality. Now again, people may suppress this part of their minds and their hearts. They may be irrational. We'll talk about that in the sermon this morning, how the Pharisees were completely irrational in dealing with Jesus. But we can identify irrationality when we see it. And we can identify rationality when we see it. What is the law of rationality? How do people function if they're not being distorted by various complications that come with sin, like the Pharisees? So, people in general know that it's rational, it makes sense to draw conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. Think about some of the little touches of rationality that Paul is able to plug into. He says, now your own poets have said, what? We are his offspring. Now it doesn't make sense to think God is like gold. See, that's plugging into the law of rationality. What about this? The creator of heaven and earth being the ruler. Wait a minute. That's rational. What? If you made it, you own it. If you made it, you can't be put into a little temple somewhere. If you made it, you don't need people bringing you food. Doesn't that make sense? He plugs into the law of rationality by saying, if you think about the power of the Creator, you're going to have to admit your concepts of God or gods are not consistent with the power of someone who made this world. So he's reasoning with them, and that's what he's able to use. That's where he's able to begin. That human beings, unless they're suppressing for some other reason the law of rationality, human beings in general know things need to make sense. Things are true or they're false. And in order to draw conclusions, we need to have evidence to support it. So those are just four kind of ideas that are embedded into Paul's situation in his explanation about what he's teaching. This is why he's called and given this opportunity to explain what he's teaching about Jesus and the resurrection. So this he does. He talks about the unknown God. He talks about this connection between how people live and how they think about God. He talks about this need to know. He's not very far from us. We're grasping, trying to understand. He's not far. And the logical conclusion is that if he's the creator, then a number of things necessarily follow. So with those things in mind, let's just start working our way down through the account. And we'll talk about, beginning in verse 22, his sermon. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive in every way you are very religious." The King James says superstitious. The word actually means demon worshipers. And that's who, in their minds, their gods were. They were people who had been heroes in their legends and in their stories who had become gods. So he addresses them. And he says, "As I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription to an unknown God. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim unto you. The God who made the world." Now their gods had various assignments. They recognized, although in an extremely twisted way, they recognized that in terms of their gods, one had authority over this, one had authority over that. Right? There's the god of the weather, or the god of war, or the god of love and fertility, or whatever it might be. They perceived their various gods as having some realm of authority or control in the world. But who made the world? He addresses the question of the authority of the one who made the world. All of their gods were a part of the world and rose to some fame and godlike status. But who made the world? And with this, he's going to implicitly list all kinds of contrasts between their view of God and this admission there's a God we don't know. And so as he begins to unfold these rational conclusions, he does so by beginning with this matter of God as the Creator. If you believe God has created you, and you are responsible to Him and accountable to Him, that has a direct connection on how you should live. So that's where he begins. The God who made the world and everything in it. Now notice this simple add-on. Being Lord of heaven and earth. Now that's an additional statement that follows from understanding God as the Creator. In other words, if He made it all, He's the ruler. That sidelines everybody else that claims some small corner of authority in the world. He made it being ruler of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands. I'll point you to the handout for just a second where I list 3 things about this part of his speech. And so if you're on the back page, Roman numeral 3, Paul's work in Athens. Letter B, sermon at the Areopagus. Number 3, Paul affirmed that the Creator must be the ruler. Now, I'm going to read you the 3 points that characterize these verses. And I like to think about them in these simple terms. He is transcendent. What does that mean? He's above everything. And how does Paul make that point? The Creator, who necessarily is the ruler, dwells not in temples made with hands. That doesn't make sense. The positive point is He is transcendent. He is above everything. Second point, He is self-sufficient. Now think about how Paul says that. The point is God is self-sufficient. How does he make that point in that context of their culture, of their religion? Neither is he served by men. Now think about how important this was for their way of thinking. They would build temples for the gods. They would provide services for the gods. Not simply, well, they have a church building and they're worshiping them. No, their way of thinking is different. That we do things for them. And then we're on their good side, so to speak. And they had an idea of some level of dependency that the gods had on them. Paul says, now, that wouldn't make any sense about the Creator. The Creator, who necessarily then is the ruler. If He made it, He owns it. He doesn't need us. We are dependent on Him. He's not dependent on us. So Paul emphasizes the true nature of God by saying He is transcendent, He is self-sufficient, and then He is the giver and sustainer of life. And then He begins to talk about relationship. God is not merely the creator and the ruler. He's our Father. He talks about relationship and communication. And we will find as we return to this and we work through these next several verses that Paul is trying to help them know God. His words do meet their needs if they're willing to hear it. God created you. God is your Lord. And He's interested in providing for you if you will recognize who He is. Paul is trying to help people come to know God. So as we wrap this up in our study next week and think about how these verses address this need. In Him we live, move, and have our being and all that. We want to read about how Paul addresses this. We'll finally come back to the question, why is it that people don't know God? Even today, when there's so much more information, it is not the times of ignorance that Paul spoke about. He says that's long gone. Now, after 20 years of complete revelation and Christianity going to the far corners of the world, why would people not know God? So we'll address that as we continue our study. Thank you so much for being in our Bible study today.